Brian, you ultimately, it's going to feel for a second here like I'm hitting fast forward, like real fast. Ultimately, Brian, you're in your role, you have this responsibility to prepare packages that will ultimately be reviewed by regulators with your company's submissions. Blair on the process development side ascertained early on, like CMC begins in early process development as early as possible. So my question for you, Brian, is how much of that kind of foundational process development CMC data exchange makes its way into the work that you do ultimately when you're prepping a submission document, when you feel like you've got it, doing that hard work, right? Like, and how much of that changes along the way? Like at what point in that continuum are you like going, okay, that's the data that's going to make its way into the submission?
Yeah, no, good question. So that so-called kind of process development CMC, feedback loop, and its outcomes are essential for the preparation of the CMC packages in regulatory dossiers. So data that's collected through manufacturing, including the process parameters and the analytical results and all those things that Blair talked about, are critical components of the documentation. The data is the essential part of this feedback loop for process control and optimization, and it also is an important record from a regulatory perspective, so that you can demonstrate process reliability, robustness, and repeatability to the health authorities. So, like Blair said, the process involves collecting data from various sources, and then you take that data and you analyze it using whatever technologies you have at your fingertips, and you look and make sure if there are any changes that need to be made with regards to the required standards or product specifications in order to meet that critical safety, quality, and efficacy as part of the target profile you've established. And once you've identified the changes, you incorporate it into the CMC package, and then you submit it to the relevant health authorities for approval. So it's extremely pivotal from a regulatory standpoint.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the, when you think about the again from your consultancy standpoint, you think about some of the common challenges that you see CMC teams facing in collecting that data and meeting the regulators' requirements? What are they? Like what are the challenges you're seeing?
Yeah, good question. We could almost have an entire discussion devoted just to this one topic, but just to name a few. So of course CMC teams are responsible for ensuring that drug products meet all regulatory requirements, but this is a very daunting task because of the complexity of the regulatory landscape and the fact that you need to keep up with the changes in regulations. So and you have to do this all within the context of being CGMP compliant, of course. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the challenges or stumbling blocks in my experience that I've seen CMC teams have to deal with? Well, if you're a commercial manufacturer, one of the biggest challenges is when you need to roll out a change to a manufacturing process globally. So when you implement a technical or regulatory change within the existing framework, sometimes this poses special challenges if it's a globally licensed product that's produced at multiple sites. And some of the most challenging changes that I've seen to roll out are when companies try to introduce continuous manufacturing processes. And fortunately, there's a new FDA guidance that was just published on the subject. And then you have kind of niche technologies that are associated with this, like process analytical technology to monitor these processes in real time. Mm-hmm. So that's one big issue. Another challenge that I see is, especially when you have a smaller company that doesn't have the ability to do a lot of regulatory intelligence. The frenetic pace of global regulatory changes and trying to keep up with them is another challenge that I've seen for sponsors.
Yeah.
And companies need to be as proactive and vigilant as they can about monitoring these changes, especially when it comes to some of the major regulatory players like the U.S. and Europe and Asia, because those rapidly evolving changes are going to have a profound impact, on the CMC packages. And I'll just mention one more here because I think in this day and age, this is very relevant and timely. Another big challenge that I've seen is when you have mergers and acquisitions that actually occur within organizations. So if you look at financial sources like Bloomberg, these kind of reached a peak in 2015 because there were a lot, and it's started to die down a little bit, but it hasn't obviously stopped because a lot of companies banked on M&As to improve their marketing position, expand their product portfolio, and invest in new therapeutic areas. But there are plenty of unique challenges for CMC regulatory when it comes to performing due diligence for all these types of activities. During due diligence, the development pathway required to commercialize any pre-commercial candidates has to be vetted out and determined in terms of the time and the cost and the gaps that need to be performed prior to filing that NDA or BLA. In terms of dossier completeness, you have to review previous regulatory authority communications, tech transfer compatibility going from site to site. And like I said, there are many, many different challenges that are faced, and you could have an entire discussion.
Yeah. Well, you hit on some. Yeah. You hit on some of the big ones, and I appreciate that. Blair, I'm interested in your perspective because some of the things that Brian just talked about, kind of turn back to process development stuff, right? Like the adoption of continuous, adoption of new manufacturing technologies. What are some of the more, I don't know, give us some highlights from your career, the more disruptive forces on CMC efforts at the companies you've worked for?
So some of the more disruptive ones are when we've been working with some of the viral vectors right now. Those regulations are like changing as you're writing your document. So we've run into a number of those times where it's actually been because of collaboration amongst colleagues I have that they're starting to get feedback from the FDA on a particular issue that I got the same, and we were getting the same verbiage, so we knew it was a hot button for the FDA that we all had to solve immediately because our IND was going to be placed on hold. So there were some of those, some of the ones other ones that if you're looking for established guidelines or values, they don't necessarily exist, but there's an expectation. So it's really understanding some of the expectations, and that's working with your really good consultants or colleagues in the field to make sure your process achieves those expectations even early on. Otherwise, you'll find yourself on clinical hold, as I have.
I mean, people treat it like it's a bad word, but it's like, especially of late in the last couple of years. I mean, chances are better that you will experience a clinical hold at some point in your near-term career than not. Yeah, so no shame in your game, Blair. No shame in your game.
And it made us really evaluate the process in even a more methodical way to ensure that we could take it forward and it was scalable. And, in some of those cases, we've worked with the regulatory agencies it's like, what can we do now to advance the clinical trial in a safe manner for you? And what will we do several years from now when we are moving into the next phase? And so they were really good about working with us to understand the nuances they were looking for that aren't necessarily always clear. In this case, was written responses.
Yeah.
So it's really sitting down and having that discussion with them. We're also seeing it in raw materials. The grade of raw materials that the regulators are expecting in early phase versus late phase. It's becoming a much narrower gap of what is GMP versus non-GMP.
Yeah.
And in fact, we implement that in process development. It's like we're going to use GMP level raw materials that we're going to use in our process, so we avoid some of the potential surprises you could run into as you do the development. So those are some ways we also mitigate. And then to Brian's point, is you got to keep up on the information. There's a ton of information. There's resources out there. There's services out there that you can work with and subscribe to get your information and help you stay on top of it, especially when you're a smaller organization and you don't, we have a couple of really good regulatory people. They can't know everything that's going on all the time. We have to use other means of surveillance and understanding to make sure that we stay on top of the changes as they come about.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of, you queued this up perfectly when you mentioned that the regulations are changing as you're writing, specifically in new modalities. Queued up my pitch. My colleague Anna Rose Welch is going to host on March 28th. She's going to host an event called Future Proofing mRNA Drug Manufacturing. Bioprocess Online live event, just like this one, 3/28. I believe there's a prompt on your screen. You can go there and register now. Sign up. It'll be available on demand afterwards as well.